Blood was everywhere on that prison floor, blades still dripping while guards yelled through radios that nobody answered fast enough. 4 men were down in less than 2 minutes, and the whole pod looked like a war zone. This wasn't some Hollywood story with actors pretending to bang. This was real Oklahoma time, where farm boys stood up to one of the most feared white gangs in America. They broke rules nobody was supposed to break, and the fallout didn't stop at the gates. Houses burned, bullets flew, and the feds came heavy. But how it all started, that's where the story gets wild. Back in 1967, California's San Quentin prison was already one of the toughest yards in the country, and that place was ready to explode. On January 16th of that year, a group of black inmates connected to George Jackson and W.L. Nolan formed the Black Guerrilla Family, a militant prison gang built around black power and resistance. Their emergence set off shockwaves across the white inmate population who felt outnumbered and pressed on the yard. In response, some of the white inmates decided they needed an organized squad of their own, and that decision gave birth to the Aryan Brotherhood. The group started small, but their style of recruitment was different from other prison gangs of the time, because they weren't just taking any white inmate who wanted in. They demanded blood to be spilled before a man could call himself a member, and they enforced a code called blood in, blood out. Once you joined, there was only 2 exits, either death or a permanent stay in solitary. That kind of commitment kept the gang tight, and it scared the rest of the yard because these white boys were ready to die for the new brotherhood. The Aryan Brotherhood quickly carved out their place in the California system by pushing back against the Black Guerrilla Family and other rival groups, using knives, extortion, and alliances when necessary. They also wrapped themselves in white supremacist ideology, painting swastikas on their bodies and living by racist codes that made them different from other hustlers who only cared about money. For the Brotherhood, being white wasn't just about color, it was about control, and they made sure every white inmate who stepped on the yard either rolled with them or risked getting handled. Over the next decade, the Brotherhood spread through other prisons in California and beyond, always using the same formula of violence, loyalty, and control. They quickly learned that drugs were the real currency inside, and the heroin trade gave them money, power, and influence with guards. By the late 1970s, the Aryan Brotherhood had their hands deep in the dope game, running operations that stretched from the cell blocks to the streets. When meth started to hit, they adjusted fast, and the name became feared across the system. Fast forward to the 1980s, and the Brotherhood wasn't just a prison gang anymore. They were a national organization with connections to bikers, cartel figures, and street dealers. Their reach went far outside those concrete walls, and their reputation was so savage that even hardened convicts hesitated before crossing them. That mindset of total domination followed them wherever they went, and eventually their playbook made its way into Oklahoma, a place that would become one of their strongest hubs outside California. In Oklahoma prisons, the Brotherhood established their own faction known as the Universal Aryan Brotherhood, or UAB for short. They were just as ruthless as the original, maybe worse, because they were operating in smaller rural towns where law enforcement resources were limited. The UAB used the same blood in, blood out code, the same racist ideology, and the same demand that every white inmate show allegiance or face brutal consequences. For a young white convict entering the Oklahoma system, the choice was stark. Either join the UAB or risk getting stabbed in the shower. One of the most notorious UAB figures was Mikel Bulldog Smith, a man described by prison officials as the most dangerous inmate in Oklahoma. Bulldog had a reputation for enforcing discipline with extreme violence, and even hardened gang members didn't want to cross him. Under leaders like Bulldog, the UAB became a terror not just in prisons, but also in small Oklahoma towns where their influence spread through drugs and intimidation. They had outside soldiers running meth labs and trafficking routes, while the leaders inside pulled strings using contraband cell phones. The UAB's grip tightened through fear in business, with meth becoming their primary product both behind bars and out in the countryside. Meth was cheap to produce, highly addictive, and extremely profitable, and it gave the UAB steady revenue streams to keep their organization alive. They taxed dealers, moved product through girlfriends and wives, and used violence to keep everyone in line. By the 2000s, investigators were saying the UAB wasn't just a prison gang anymore. They were running a criminal syndicate with deep control in Oklahoma. What made them even more dangerous was the way they played politics inside the yard. If you were white and refused to fall in line, you became a target, because in their eyes, Every white inmate had to show unity. The UAB wasn't giving out passes, and even small-time hustlers had to pay tribute or risk retaliation. That's why law enforcement and corrections officers called them one of the most organized and ruthless groups in the state. They weren't just fighting rivals, they were dominating their own people too, making sure no white inmate could operate without their permission. Their rules were simple, but brutal. No snitching, no cowardice, and no leaving the gang alive. Violating those codes could get you stabbed, strangled, or disappeared. That code of silence made it almost impossible for investigators to crack their cases, because witnesses rarely lived long enough or dared to testify. Families of victims were often too scared to speak out, and even guards whispered about the UAB's power in hushed tones. It was like a shadow government inside the prisons, and the reach of that power extended out into rural Oklahoma, like tentacles. The UAB didn't just survive by being brutal, they thrived because they built an economy around meth that touched nearly every county in the state. They had connections with Mexican suppliers, biker gangs, and local cooks who churned out pounds of product from barns and trailers. Their people on the outside dropped off cash, wired money, and handled drug runs, all while the leaders stayed locked up behind walls but still called the shots. It was a machine that kept grinding, and it felt unstoppable. By the time the farm boys of Oklahoma stepped up to challenge them, the Universal Aryan Brotherhood had already built a legend of fear that stretched from cell blocks to back roads. They weren't used to anybody saying no, especially not other white boys from the same towns they controlled. The very idea that someone would reject their supremacy and carve their own path was an insult, and that insult was enough to light the fuse for a war that would leave bodies piled on both sides. By the 1990s, Oklahoma prisons were crowded with white inmates who didn't all want the Brotherhood's leash. These dudes were from places like Cimarron, Wewoka, Shawnee, and small towns scattered across the countryside. Many of them were working-class farm boys who landed in prison on drug charges. They didn't care about politics or swastikas, they cared about survival and their own freedom. The Aryan Brotherhood demanded every white convict in Oklahoma prisons bend the knee and fall in line. Some did, because saying no meant catching a blade in the yard showers, but there were others who didn't buy into racist ideology and refused to serve supremacist leaders. Those holdouts started linking together, building an identity separate from the Aryan shot callers. That loose identity hardened into something real, and eventually it became known as the Irish Mob of Oklahoma. They weren't Irish immigrants with East Coast roots, they were local white boys fighting against a racist gang. The name gave them swagger and culture, something to stand on against the Universal Aryan Brotherhood, and their numbers grew steadily as more inmates refused to live under Aryan Brotherhood control. Law enforcement later said the Irish mob formed precisely because those white inmates wanted independence. Tulsa Police Gang Unit's Sergeant Sean Larkin explained it clearly during interviews with Oklahoma reporters. He said the Irish mob rejected supremacist views and chose business over ideology, which made them dangerous to the Aryan network. They weren't about brotherhood politics, they were about hustling drugs, making money, and staying alive. Inside those prisons, the Irish mob quickly became known for backing each other with real loyalty. They fought in groups, moved contraband, and refused to pay taxes to Aryan enforcers. That defiance meant bloody skirmishes in cell blocks, sometimes with knives, sometimes with fists, sometimes with boiling water. The Irish mob proved they weren't scared to throw down when pressed by stronger numbers. Outside the walls, their structure carried into towns across Oklahoma, with members running meth distribution lines. They worked from motels in Tulsa, trailer parks in rural counties, and safe houses in Oklahoma City. Unlike the Aryan Brotherhood, they didn't mind cutting deals with Black or Hispanic gangs. If it made business sense, the Irish mob was down to move product with anyone. That pragmatism gave them opportunities, especially in Oklahoma, where drug networks crossed racial lines every day. They found allies in Hispanic traffickers who supplied meth and sometimes linked with Black dealers running crack cocaine. While the Aryan Brotherhood saw that as betrayal, the Irish mob saw it as smart hustling. It kept their money flowing and their reputation growing inside and outside of prison. By the mid-1990s, reports already tied the Irish mob to violent crimes in Tulsa and Muskogee. Police noted that their members rotated between motels, never staying in one spot for too long. That made it harder to track them down, and it gave them a ghost-like presence on the streets. Authorities estimated maybe only a few dozen active members, but their violence gave them outsized fear. One thing that really set the Irish mob apart was the role of women in the gang. While the Aryan Brotherhood only used feather woods for smuggling or backdooring rivals, the Irish mob treated women as equals. Female members were fully active, holding rank, enforcing rules, and putting in work without hesitation. That gave the gang a different vibe, and women inside it became known for extreme loyalty. There was a notorious incident at an Oklahoma women's prison where female Irish mob members cut off tattoos. They hacked another inmate's ink with blades because they believed she was a snitch. That moment sent a chilling message across the system, showing that even the women were ruthless. They didn't tolerate betrayal, and their violence added to the mob's growing reputation for savagery. On the streets, Irish mob women were also heavily involved in drug trafficking and setting up enemies. They used beauty and trust to lure rivals, then handed them over to their male counterparts. Law enforcement officers said some female members were even more aggressive than the men at times. Their involvement made the gang flexible, unpredictable, and even harder to contain from outside pressure. The Irish mob's image as farm boys wasn't just talk. Many members came straight from rural roots. They grew up in towns with dirt roads, farming equipment, and oil fields dominating the landscape. That country toughness translated into prison life, where fights and hustles felt like survival, not ambition. Guards and inmates alike said these boys were cut from a different cloth, fearless and stubborn. Early skirmishes between the Irish mob and Aryan Brotherhood became part of prison legend in Oklahoma. Stories circulated about knife fights in day rooms, beatdowns in showers, and long-running grudges spilling into yards. Even though the Irish mob lacked the Aryan numbers, they earned respect for never folding. Their defiance built morale, and every win against Aryans gave them stronger credibility with other inmates. By the late 1990s, law enforcement knew they weren't just another prison crew passing through. Reports showed the Irish mob tied to 4 or 5 murders in Tulsa during that time. Their presence was small but loud, with police noting how quickly their violence escalated when pressed. It was becoming clear they were carving out their own place in Oklahoma's criminal map. The Irish mob developed a culture that made them distinct from the Aryan Brotherhood at every level. Where the Brotherhood demanded submission to ideology, the mob demanded loyalty to the group and the grind. Where the Brotherhood silenced women to background roles, the mob gave women full membership and power. Where the Brotherhood refused alliances across racial lines, the mob made deals to stay alive and profitable. That culture meant the Irish mob grew in confidence and independence, and their reputation inside prisons spread. Every new white inmate who arrived in Oklahoma prisons now had a choice between submission or resistance. And more, those who didn't want to bow to supremacists found themselves drawn to the mob. That was the start of a rivalry that would explode into Oklahoma's bloodiest prison clash. By the 2000s, Oklahoma prisons had turned into pressure cookers where gangs ran the daily routine. Inside those walls, contraband cell phones and meth were as common as cigarettes once had been. Corrections officers constantly reported shortages of staff while gangs filled the gaps with their own order. That meant rackets for drugs, extortion, and gambling were dominated by whichever gang had muscle. The Universal Aryan Brotherhood had the muscle, at least on paper, because they demanded loyalty from all whites. They treated the prison system like territory, claiming whole pods and forcing newcomers to swear allegiance. For decades, that control went unchecked because anyone who tried to refuse quickly got hurt. Their entire system relied on fear, and most whites chose safety over defiance. The Irish mob refused to play that game, which made every yard more dangerous than the last. They didn't check in with Aryan shot callers, and they didn't pay Aryan taxes. They openly said no when told to bend, which was like spitting in a soldier's face. In Oklahoma prisons, that defiance wasn't just risky, it was a declaration of war. Contraband was the currency of power, and meth became the crown jewel everyone wanted to control. Irish mob members smuggled drugs through girlfriends, wives, and associates visiting from outside towns like Tulsa and Wewoka. The Universal Aryan Brotherhood moved their own shipments, often using biker allies and Mexican contacts tied to the meth trade. Both sides knew whoever controlled meth controlled the pod, the block, and the prison economy. By 2014, investigators noted Irish mob members were refusing Aryan Brotherhood rules in Cimarron Correctional Facility. Cimarron was a medium-security prison in Cushing, Oklahoma, operated by a private company named CoreCivic. The place had a reputation for being violent, with stabbings and fights a regular part of the calendar. When two gangs both wanted control of the same territory, trouble became inevitable. Prisoners later told investigators the tension was visible, even if officers pretended not to see it. Shanks were being made from scrap metal, filed down from beds, and hidden under chairs or inside vents. Both groups were quietly stockpiling blades, expecting the day to come when they would need them. The Irish mob's numbers were smaller, but their reputation for reckless fighting made them unpredictable. The Universal Aryan Brotherhood wanted the Irish mob under their thumb, but that wasn't happening in Cimarron. Every time a new white inmate arrived, Irish mob recruiters were there to pull them aside. They told them, "You don't need swastikas to survive here, you just need loyalty and heart." That pitch worked on plenty of young men who didn't like the Brotherhood's politics. Guards noticed the separation on the yard, with Aryans congregating together while Irish mob stayed tight in smaller clusters. They weren't blending together during meals, and they weren't mingling during rec time either. The divide was obvious, and every inmate knew something was coming sooner or later. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but the pod was primed for blood. On September 12th, 2015, the signs were already flashing hours before the riot actually exploded. Black inmates affiliated with the Bloods approached Officer Terrence Lockett, the lone guard posted in Charlie North Unit. They told him they wanted to be locked in their cells early, which was unusual behavior. Most inmates preferred being out in the day room where they had freedom of movement. Lockett noticed that all the black prisoners had suddenly moved upstairs to the upper tier of the unit. Downstairs, only white inmates remained, which felt like an unnatural segregation compared to normal days. According to later testimony, a bloodshot caller whispered to Lockett that he should stay upstairs. That was a quiet warning that something ugly was about to go down below. Lockett did what any officer would do. He radioed supervisors to report unusual movement in his unit. He told them he felt tension and believed a fight might be brewing between groups of whites. Instead of sending immediate backup, his supervisors dismissed the warning and told him to call again if something happened. That failure to act left him alone in a unit filled with armed gang members. Rumors had already been spreading among inmates that the Irish mob was planning something soon. They didn't want to keep paying tribute, and they were ready to send a bloody message. The Aryan Brotherhood had their own weapons ready, prepared to enforce their supremacy with steel. Both sides knew the standoff couldn't drag on forever without somebody making the first move. Hours before the violence, some inmates described a strange quiet settling across the pod. The television was still on, but fewer people laughed or shouted compared to usual nights. Conversations dropped into whispers, and eyes stayed locked on rival groups across the room. It was like a storm cloud sitting just above the roof, heavy but waiting to break. Lockett, stuck in that unit, felt the tension in his bones, and later said he was terrified. He had one radio, one set of keys, and no backup anywhere close by to help. Even he could sense this wasn't going to be another minor fistfight broken up by pepper spray. This was going to be something big, something unforgettable, and he was right. Prison culture in Oklahoma had always been violent, but this level of organized hostility was different. The Irish mob had no intention of backing down, even though they knew their numbers were smaller. The Universal Aryan Brotherhood felt insulted because white inmates rejecting them was seen as betrayal. The stage was set for something the state had never seen before. Later investigations would confirm that at least 21 shanks had been hidden in Charlie North Unit. That number showed exactly how much preparation had gone into the coming conflict. Nobody makes that many blades unless they are expecting mass violence instead of one-on-one fights. Those weapons represented weeks of planning by inmates right under the noses of corrections officers. Every signal pointed toward an explosion, yet nothing was done to prevent it, and the fuse kept burning. By the time the Irish mob made their move, the entire pod was primed for chaos. The Bloods upstairs were safe in their locked cells, watching history unfold through bars. The white inmates downstairs were seconds away from Oklahoma's bloodiest prison battle. The quiet in Charlie North snapped when a group of Irish mob members came down the stairs. They moved with purpose, heads low, hands ready to grab weapons they had stashed earlier. Some blades were hidden under chairs, others tucked behind vents, waiting for this exact moment. Prisoners upstairs already knew what was about to happen, which is why they stayed locked. As the Irish mob reached the day room floor, voices broke the silence with raw gang calls. Somebody shouted, "Sinn Fein, mob gang," and that cry bounced off the concrete walls like thunder. From the opposite side, an Aryan Brotherhood member yelled back, "Wood," which was their prison slang. In that instant, the entire pod erupted into chaos, with steel flashing in every direction. Shanks came out fast, crude pieces of sharpened metal wrapped in cloth or tape for grip. 24 inmates got involved in the melee, stabbing, swinging, and wrestling in the middle of the pod. Blood hit the floor almost immediately, spraying across tables and dripping down onto the concrete. Officer Terrence Lockett screamed into his radio for backup, but confusion slowed everything down. In the middle of the chaos, Anthony Fulwilder was fighting for the Aryan Brotherhood at age 31. He had been serving 23 years for armed robbery and shooting with intent to kill. Multiple sharp force injuries brought him down, and he died after being airlifted from the facility. His death marked one of the Aryan Brotherhood's hardest losses inside Cimarron that day. Another Aryan casualty was 26-year-old Michael Maiden Jr., a prospect still proving himself inside the gang. He had been serving an 8-year sentence for firearm possession and stolen vehicle charges. He caught a fatal shoulder stab wound during the battle and died right there on the floor. Maiden's death showed how prospects carried just as much risk as full members. On the Irish mob side, 23-year-old Kyle Tiffey was caught in the frenzy. He was serving 5 years for drug possession and 2 more for assaulting an officer. Multiple stab wounds ended his life, leaving him dead before guards even reached the scene. Kyle's story was especially sad because he was still so young and reckless. Another Irish mob loss was 29-year-old Christopher Tenure, also serving 5 years at Cimarron. His charges included receiving stolen vehicles, and he had been making noise as an Irish member. He took a stab wound to the chest that killed him quickly during the fighting. Autopsy later showed meth in his system, which reflected how drugs stayed constant in prison. By the time the fight slowed, 4 men were dead and several more were gravely wounded. At least 7 knives had been used, leaving the day room slick with blood pooling on the floor. Survivors carried deep cuts, broken bones, and trauma from watching friends killed within seconds of violence. Some were dragged out on stretchers while guards shouted orders and tried to separate survivors. Lockett, the lone guard on the top tier, was panicked as he tried to call help. At first, he accidentally gave the wrong unit name when screaming into his radio. That mistake cost precious minutes as officers scrambled to figure out where to send backup. His terror was clear in his voice, with screams and chaos loud behind him on the call. It took 40 minutes before enough officers arrived to gain control and shut down the riot. By then, 4 lives were gone. Blood stained the floor, and weapons were scattered across the pod. Pepper spray and batons were used late, but the real damage had already been done. Inmates described the scene as a massacre, one of the worst in Oklahoma prison history. Families got word fast after the incident, and many of them were shocked at what happened. Mothers, fathers, and siblings demanded answers about how their loved ones died inside a state prison. They wanted to know why a single guard was left alone to watch so many inmates. They wanted to know why supervisors ignored warnings from Lockett hours before the fight broke out. Anthony Fulwilder's relatives remembered him as troubled, but they still demanded accountability from the prison system. Michael Maiden's family learned their son died as a prospect, not even a full Aryan member yet. Kyle Tiffey's family mourned a young man who never made it past 23 years old. Christopher Tenure's loved ones questioned why he was in such a violent unit in the first place. The prison locked down immediately after the riot, keeping every inmate in cells while investigations began. Media reports described it as Oklahoma's deadliest prison fight, shocking both the public and politicians. Lawsuits quickly followed, with accusations that Cimarron staff had failed to prevent the bloodshed. CoreCivic, the private company operating the facility, suddenly faced scrutiny for how they ran the prison. Inmates who survived told investigators they always knew something was coming before that day. They spoke about weeks of buildup, with both gangs quietly stockpiling weapons inside the unit. They said everyone in Charlie North felt the tension, but nobody wanted to be the first. The Irish mob finally made the move, sparking the chain of violence that left 4 men gone. The aftermath of Cimarron sent ripples far beyond the walls of that facility. Families grieved, lawsuits filed, and Oklahoma prisons braced for more violence between the rival gangs. Nobody forgot that day, and it marked a turning point in the feud between farm boys and Aryans. It proved that defiance against the Brotherhood could cost lives, but also send a strong message. After the Cimarron riot, attention quickly turned toward the company running the prison that day. Cimarron Correctional Facility in Cushing was operated by CoreCivic, which used to be called Corrections Corporation of America. They were a private operator that Oklahoma relied on heavily to house thousands of inmates. The massacre exposed how much responsibility they carried, and people started asking tough questions. Investigators discovered serious problems with how the prison was managed before and during the riot. One major issue was the video evidence that could have shown exactly what happened inside Charlie North. A chief of security admitted he deleted footage from a handheld camera that recorded staff giving CPR. that violated Department of Corrections policy and destroyed potential evidence that families demanded to see. Other fixed cameras inside the unit either malfunctioned or mysteriously failed to capture usable footage of the brawl. Some of the surveillance recordings that should have covered the entire shift were never turned over to investigators. And with 4 men dead, the idea of lost or deleted video footage created outrage across the state. Families wanted accountability, but missing evidence made answers even harder to find. Staffing levels also became a major point of investigation after the bloodshed. Mandatory security posts were filled, but at least 4 to 8 additional posts went unmanned. One of the most critical stations, Central Control, was operated by only one inexperienced officer. Policy required 2 officers there because of its importance, but CoreCivic let it slide with 1 worker. That short staffing left Officer Terrence Lockett completely isolated inside Charlie North. When the violence erupted, Lockett had no immediate help, and supervisors were slow to respond. He had warned them earlier that something felt wrong, but they brushed him off and told him to wait. The company's staffing choices put both him and the inmates in a deadly position. By the time backup came, 4 men were already dead, and others were critically wounded. Another CoreCivic policy that came under fire was their approach to cell doors inside Cimarron. They kept cell doors locked at all times during recreation, even when inmates were out. That meant when the knives came out, nobody could run back to safety. Prisoners were trapped in the day room, forced to fight or get cut down where they stood. Officers later admitted the locked doors made controlling the riot even harder. The Department of Corrections launched an after-action review, but critics said it felt more like a cover-up. CoreCivic had its own staff involved in reviewing the massacre, raising questions about conflict of interest. Families accused the company of protecting itself rather than exposing the truth about what happened. Lawsuits soon followed, with families of the dead inmates filing claims of negligence against CoreCivic. At least 3 major civil suits were filed, 2 by families of slain inmates and 1 by a survivor. They accused CoreCivic of failing to prevent foreseeable violence, understaffing the prison and destroying evidence. In response, CoreCivic denied wrongdoing but tried to push blame onto the inmates themselves. In some filings, they even named gang members as co-defendants, trying to share potential liability. The lawsuits painted a picture of a company more worried about profits than safety. Lawyers argued CoreCivic saved money by cutting staff and ignoring dangerous warning signs before the riot. They pointed to reports of shanks being found and gang tensions rising long before September 12, 2015. Yet nothing was done to separate the groups or add more officers inside Charlie North. Public outrage boiled over when details reached local media and national outlets like The Frontier and The Washington Post. Headlines called it Oklahoma's deadliest prison riot, and people demanded accountability from both the state and CoreCivic. Politicians were pressed to explain why the state kept contracting with private companies despite repeated problems. Families of the victims held vigils, interviews, and rallies to demand changes inside Oklahoma prisons. Corrections officials eventually admitted the response was not swift and effective, which was a serious understatement. 40 minutes passed before guards fully controlled the unit, and those minutes sealed the fate of 4 men. Critics argued that better staffing and functioning equipment could have saved lives that day. Instead, the bloodbath exposed how fragile the prison system was under private management. The story of the Cimarron massacre was no longer just about gang violence between whites. It became a case study in negligence, corporate responsibility, and the dangers of privatized prisons. CoreCivic insisted they followed policy, but families said the evidence told a very different story. Missing video, locked doors, and understaffing created the perfect conditions for a massacre. Public pressure eventually forced CoreCivic to make changes, but they never admitted direct fault in the deaths. Some of the lawsuits were settled out of court, with details kept confidential under sealed agreements. For the families, no settlement could replace the lives lost inside Charlie North that day. They wanted truth and accountability, but what they got felt like money and silence. For many in Oklahoma, the Cimarron massacre became a symbol of how bad things had gotten. People saw how gangs controlled prisons, how private companies cut corners, and how lives were treated cheaply. The outrage didn't fade quickly because the images of that day were burned into memory, and the fact that evidence vanished only fueled suspicion that the full truth was hidden. In the end, CoreCivic kept operating, but their name stayed tied to Oklahoma's bloodiest prison riot. The Irish mob and the Aryan Brotherhood shed blood, but CoreCivic carried blame for letting it happen. Families were left grieving, lawsuits dragged on, and public trust in prison leadership dropped lower than ever before. Cimarron Correctional Facility would always be remembered as the place where everything went wrong. In the months after the Cimarron massacre, Oklahoma prosecutors promised justice for the 4 men killed. Families of Anthony Fullwilder, Michael Maiden, Kyle Tiffey, and Christopher Tenure wanted accountability for the lives taken inside. By 2017, Payne County District Attorney Laura Thomas announced felony charges against 7 inmates. Every man charged was linked to the Irish mob, not a single Aryan Brotherhood member. The 7 included Stephen Ray Thompson, Jonathan Whittington, Philip Wayne Jordan Jr., Jordan James Scott, James Danny Placker, Gage Broom, and Corey Cruda. Prosecutors argued they were part of the group seen coming down the stairs. The charge was participating in a riot, because proving individual murders was nearly impossible. For families, it looked like a step forward, but cracks in the case appeared quickly. The biggest problem was video footage, which should have been the strongest evidence in court. The security footage from Charlie North was grainy and failed to clearly show who stabbed who. Guards huddled together in meetings trying to identify suspects, but their process looked sloppy and unreliable. Later in court, officers admitted they could not even say who wrote names on suspect photos. That shaky identification undermined the case badly because no clear chain of evidence existed. Defense lawyers jumped on the issue, saying it was impossible to prove involvement beyond reasonable doubt. When officers themselves confessed to uncertainty, jurors were unlikely to convict anyone for murder. What prosecutors hoped would be a slam dunk started falling apart piece by piece. Testimony from Officer Terrence Lockett should have helped, but his credibility was destroyed before trial. He was arrested for trying to smuggle drugs into a prison while the case was pending. Defense lawyers argued no jury could believe a man facing his own criminal charges. His earlier warnings and eyewitness accounts suddenly carried no weight inside the courtroom. Another Department of Corrections employee who was supposed to testify was also under criminal investigation. That meant both of the state's key correctional witnesses were compromised before the trial even began. Without reliable guards on the stand, the case leaned even harder on poor video and inmate testimony. But inmates were never going to risk snitching in a case like this. Inside Oklahoma prisons, the code of silence is enforced with knives, not warnings. The Aryan Brotherhood is notorious for its kill all witnesses reputation, and the Irish mob is no softer. Not one inmate in Charlie North came forward with direct testimony against another prisoner. The fear of retaliation was stronger than any loyalty to truth or justice. By 2018, the district attorney had to admit the case could not move forward. She told families there was not enough credible evidence to prove charges beyond reasonable doubt. With weak identifications, disgraced witnesses, and no inmate testimony, the prosecutions collapsed completely. A judge dismissed all charges against the 7 defendants, leaving families stunned and angry. 4 men had been butchered inside a prison, yet nobody was convicted or punished for it. Families called it betrayal, saying the justice system had failed their sons and brothers. They demanded to know how a massacre in state custody produced zero accountability. One grieving relative said 4 men were butchered and no justice was served for anyone. The dismissal sent a dangerous message across Oklahoma's prison yards. It showed that even the deadliest prison riot in state history produced no convictions. It told gangs that silence and intimidation worked better than any lawyer could. As long as nobody snitched, prosecutors had little power to hold anyone responsible. For the Universal Aryan Brotherhood, that outcome looked like validation of their control. For the Irish mob, it was proof they could clash with Aryans and escape legal punishment. Inmates on both sides took note, reinforcing the idea that violence behind bars was untouchable. The code of silence had beaten the justice system in full view of the public. Families carried the grief while the gangs carried the lesson, and the cycle continued. Parents buried sons, children lost fathers, and communities watched the system shrug its shoulders. Prosecutors quietly moved on, but the wounds stayed fresh for everyone connected to those 4 men. The message was clear across Oklahoma prisons. Murder inside the walls rarely leads to convictions. That outcome turned the Cimarron massacre from tragedy into cautionary tale, not just for families but the state. It proved how fragile justice became when gangs enforced silence with blades and fear. It left CoreCivic criticized, prosecutors humiliated, and Oklahoma corrections exposed for its failures. Most importantly, it left families broken, with memories of men who never came home alive. The massacre at Cimarron did not close the chapter. It pushed the violence onto Oklahoma streets. When 4 bodies dropped in Charlie North, both gangs carried grudges back into the free world. Soldiers on the outside felt obligated to retaliate for their brothers locked up. That cycle turned small towns into battlefields where bullets and fire replaced prison shanks. Wewoka, a quiet Seminole County town of barely 3,000 people, became the heart of the storm. Residents who had lived through calm years suddenly compared nights to World War III. Houses were firebombed, cars riddled with bullets, and gunshots echoed across neighborhoods like clockwork. Families who had nothing to do with gangs started fearing their own porches at night. One of the most terrifying incidents came when a Molotov cocktail flew through a bedroom window. The target was Vincent Watts, a Wewoka resident who barely survived the attack. Flames tore through his house while he was still in bed trying to breathe through smoke. He escaped with burns, but his home was destroyed in the fire set by gang beef. Watts later told reporters he thought the attack was meant for someone else. He believed the arsonist confused his house for a rival's residence connected to gangs. That mistake almost killed him, showing how innocent people were paying for prison grudges. They have to learn they can't settle problems with explosives, Watts said bitterly in interviews. The violence did not stop with fire, it carried over into shootings that scarred families. A 16-year-old boy in Wewoka was caught in the crossfire of a drive-by. Bullets hit him in the back, leaving him paralyzed and unsure if he would walk again. His family was crushed because he was just a kid with no connection to gangs. Every shooting created more fear, and rumors spread about green-lit hits ordered from prison cells. Both the Irish mob and the Universal Aryan Brotherhood were said to have lists of enemies. Some of those names were rivals, some were suspected snitches, and some were family members. People whispered that missing persons in rural counties were actually buried victims of the feud. Investigators later uncovered clandestine burial grounds connected to the Universal Aryan Brotherhood in Logan County. Behind a fortified compound, they found charred and dismembered human remains scattered in hidden pits. Officials believed up to a dozen victims were dumped there over the years. Some were likely rivals. Others suspected informants who crossed the wrong man at the wrong time. Other bodies surfaced near oil wells in rural Oklahoma counties, fueling stories of secret gang graveyards. Families with missing relatives started wondering if their loved ones were casualties of this feud. Officials quietly admitted that keeping some people alive became the only goal in certain cases. Witness protection programs stretched thin because intimidation was stronger than any courtroom threat. In Wewoka, families lived under siege conditions while law enforcement stayed silent for weeks. Police refused to explain the fires, the shootings, or the chaos erupting in town. That silence made locals angry because everybody knew it was Aryans and Irish fighting in their streets. Officials avoided naming gangs, but residents already recognized tattoos, faces, and colors tied to each group. Community frustration boiled over during town meetings where residents demanded stronger protection and clear answers. People said they were tired of hearing gunshots without seeing arrests or prosecutions. Some described nights where multiple houses burned while law enforcement gave no explanations. Others feared speaking publicly because everyone knew retaliation could come for anyone opening their mouth. Eventually, federal authorities stepped in after pressure mounted and residents compared Wewoka to a war zone. The FBI, ATF, U.S. Marshals, and Seminole Nation Light Horse Police joined local departments. In mid-2017, they arrested 6 individuals directly tied to gang violence in Wewoka. Those suspects were linked to a fatal shooting and several arsons in town. The arrests brought relief to residents who have been living like targets for months. "It's been like World War III. We don't need this," said Watts after hearing the news. He had survived the firebombing and wanted peace back in his community. Other families echoed his relief, hoping the arrests marked the end of the street war. But even with arrests, people in Oklahoma understood this was not just a local flare-up. The feud between the Irish mob and the Aryan Brotherhood ran through prisons, towns, and families. Every time prison blood spilled, violence followed outside, spreading into neighborhoods and small towns like brush fire. For Wewoka, that connection was painfully clear every time a house burned or bullets hit walls. The aftermath showed how much influence prison gangs still had over the outside world. Leaders locked up in cells were giving orders through contraband phones smuggled by associates. Soldiers on the street followed those orders, carrying out drive-by shootings and firebombings. The violence reminded everyone that prison beefs never stayed behind walls in Oklahoma. By late 2017, federal sweeps slowed the violence, but scars remained across Seminole County. Families rebuilt burned houses, while others learned to live with permanent injuries from stray bullets. Residents carried fear long after, remembering how their small town felt like a battlefield. Wewoka's story became a symbol of what happens when prison gangs run unchecked. The feud that started with defiance inside Cimarron now had civilians caught in the fire. It was no longer just white inmates fighting inside pods, it was neighborhoods under siege. Houses, kids, and bystanders felt the weight of a war they never asked for. The line between prison violence and street violence blurred until there was no separation at all. When people talked about the Irish mob in Oklahoma, one name always came up first. That name was David Postelle, a farm boy who rose into a prison gang boss. His story was tied to violence long before he ever claimed leadership inside. David was the brother of Gilbert Postelle, who was executed in 2022 for mass murder. Gilbert carried out a gruesome quadruple homicide in 2005, spraying bullets into a trailer in Oklahoma City. The victims were James Alderson, his girlfriend, and 2 of her children, all gunned down brutally. The case shocked the state, and Gilbert's execution years later cemented his reputation as ruthless. David was tied into that world, serving a life sentence for his role. Even behind bars, David refused to fade into the background like many lifers. Instead, he built power by linking himself to the Irish mob's prison-based operations. He relied on contraband cell phones smuggled into prisons by girlfriends and associates. With those phones, he directed drug shipments, collected payments, and ordered violence when needed. Investigators later revealed that David oversaw one of the largest prison drug operations in Oklahoma history. Through wiretaps, the FBI and Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics intercepted hundreds of calls tied to his network. Those conversations showed him arranging meth deals, giving orders, and coordinating shipments across multiple counties. He turned his prison cell into a command center for a criminal empire. By 2022, prosecutors said David was the undisputed leader of the Irish mob's drug ring. Operation Center of Attention, a massive state investigation, eventually tied him to 125 convicted conspirators. Those men and women were caught running meth and heroin through Oklahoma prisons and towns. The network trafficked over 500 pounds of narcotics and moved nearly $600,000 in drug profits. For his leadership role, David received an additional life sentence stacked onto his existing punishment. That meant he would never breathe free air again, locked away permanently under federal supervision. Still, his legend inside the Irish mob grew because he represented defiance against Aryan control. He was the farm boy leader who proved Irish mob could organize on a large scale. On the other side of the feud stood Chance Allen Wilson, known by the name Wolfhead. His story was darker, crueler, and more twisted than many could believe. Born and raised in Oklahoma, Chance lived with a reputation for meth use from an early age. He wasn't just an addict, he became a dealer and enforcer tied to violent acts. In 2012, Chance committed one of the most horrific crimes connected to his name. He injected his 16-year-old sister, Salida, with a lethal dose of methamphetamine. Instead of helping when she overdosed, he left her in a bathtub while she died. That act led to a first-degree murder conviction, earning him a 15-year state sentence. Prison did not stop him from becoming more powerful. It only gave him a bigger stage. By the mid-2000s, Chance had risen through the universal Aryan Brotherhood ranks with violence and intimidation. Using contraband phones, he directed meth distribution networks reaching across Oklahoma towns and prisons. He had soldiers outside moving pounds of meth, collecting cash, and enforcing Brotherhood rules. Federal agents eventually tied Chance to a massive meth operation inside Oklahoma prisons. In 2023, a multi-year RICO investigation convicted 69 UAB members and associates. Authorities said Chance Wolfhead Wilson was the statewide leader orchestrating the organization. His empire included more than 300 pounds of meth, 62 seized firearms, and $400,000 in proceeds. For his crimes, Chance received an additional 30-year federal sentence stacked onto his state time. That meant he would likely die inside federal custody, never stepping outside walls again. Officials described him as a perfect example of how dangerous prison gang leaders remained. Even after killing his sister, he found new power through the Brotherhood's violent culture. Both David and Chance represented the core difference between Irish mob and the Aryan Brotherhood. David's leadership came from pragmatism, running business with whoever would move product. He didn't care about skin color or supremacist politics. He cared about loyalty and money. His farm boy background shaped a crew that worked with whoever made sense for business. Chance represented the opposite approach, rooted in supremacist ideology and brutality without hesitation. The Universal Aryan Brotherhood demanded control of every white inmate, no exceptions. They forced loyalty with knives and blood oaths, enforcing obedience through ruthless violence. Chance embodied that culture, earning his position by spilling blood and intimidating rivals. Together, these two men symbolized the feud that left Oklahoma bleeding inside prisons and outside towns. David Postelle showed how farm boys could build a network without bending to Aryan politics. Chance Wilson showed how ruthless an Aryan leader could become, killing his own blood for selfish reasons. Their names carried fear and respect across Oklahoma's prison yards and back roads. When families in Wewoka and Cushing spoke about the violence, their names always surfaced. Both leaders were proof that prison gangs never lost control just because walls surrounded them. They represented two sides of a coin, one driven by survival and money, the other by ideology and cruelty. That collision created the deadliest feud Oklahoma's prison system had ever witnessed. By 2022, law enforcement finally made their move after years of investigation and wiretaps. Oklahoma officials announced the results of Operation Center of Attention, which targeted the Irish mob directly. The operation resulted in 125 inmates tied to the Irish mob convicted. Collectively, those defendants received more than 1,350 years of time. Authorities called it one of the largest takedowns of a prison drug network in state history. The investigation exposed how David Postelle had turned his prison cell into a command office. Using contraband phones, he directed shipments of meth, heroin, and weapons through loyal associates outside. Wiretaps captured his orders and tied him directly to large-scale meth trafficking networks. During the investigation, officials seized over 500 pounds of meth and heroin linked to his crew. They also confiscated hundreds of firearms that gang members used to enforce their business. Cash worth nearly $600,000 was taken as part of the operation. The scale showed how far the Irish mob had grown under David's leadership. Prosecutors made sure David Postelle received an additional life sentence on top of his previous term. His earlier life sentence already kept him behind bars for his role in Gilbert's murders. Now another life sentence sealed his fate permanently inside federal prison custody. For law enforcement, that conviction represented a victory against the farm boy crew. Operation Center of Attention decapitated the Irish mob's prison drug trade and scattered its street soldiers. The collective sentences meant most members would spend decades locked away with little hope of freedom. For investigators, it was the largest Irish mob conviction wave Oklahoma had ever seen. Federal agencies praised the teamwork that allowed them to dismantle the network successfully. At nearly the same time, federal prosecutors were also closing in on the Universal Aryan Brotherhood. A long-running RICO case had targeted the UAB's violent operations inside and outside prison. By January 2023, 69 members and associates of the Brotherhood had been convicted. Those convictions added up to more than 418 years of federal prison time. The case also seized 62 firearms and more than 300 pounds of methamphetamine. Over $400,000 in drug proceeds were confiscated by investigators following the network's trails. Authorities said the arrests effectively crippled the Brotherhood's operations across Oklahoma. It was one of the harshest blows the Aryan Brotherhood had faced in decades. The star of that federal case was none other than Chance Wolfhead Wilson, even though he was already serving time for the murder of his teenage sister, Saleda. Federal prosecutors showed how he continued leading the Universal Aryan Brotherhood from inside prison cells. Using contraband phones, he ordered shipments, managed profits, and approved violent enforcement actions. For his leadership role, Chance Wilson received another 30-year federal sentence stacked onto his existing time. That meant Wolfhead would almost certainly die in prison, with no realistic chance of release. His sentence became symbolic because it showed law enforcement would not tolerate Aryan supremacy networks. Federal prosecutors celebrated the conviction as a major step toward crippling the Brotherhood's reach. Federal agencies boasted about dismantling both major white gangs in Oklahoma within the same 2 years. The FBI praised the removal of massive amounts of meth, firearms, and cash from communities. Homeland Security investigations described how incarcerated gang members still ran networks until agents broke them apart. The IRS Criminal Investigations Division also played a surprising role in the crackdowns. IRS investigators traced money flows that exposed laundering operations used by both gangs. They followed cash from drug sales into bank accounts, prepaid cards, and hidden assets. That financial evidence helped prosecutors prove conspiracy charges and stripped gangs of their operating funds. Taking the money hurt as much as seizing drugs or locking up soldiers. In press conferences, federal prosecutors said Oklahoma communities were safer with these convictions completed. They promised that the days of unchecked gang empires inside state prisons were ending. For families who lost loved ones in Wewoka or Cimarron, the message brought mixed feelings. Convictions were welcome, but the scars of the feud were already permanent. Still, the crackdowns proved law enforcement could hit back hard when gangs overplayed their hand. The Irish mob's massive prison drug network was gutted by Operation Center of Attention. The Universal Aryan Brotherhood's leadership was crushed under RICO convictions and long federal sentences. For the first time in years, Oklahoma officials said they regained some control. The feud between farm boys and Aryans had drawn blood on both sides, but this was different. This was the government cutting into leadership and dismantling business networks with coordinated strikes. For years, it seemed like gangs always outmaneuvered prosecutors, but not this time. Both David Postelle and Chance Wilson ended their careers trapped behind permanent federal sentences. The crackdowns did not erase the history of bloodshed, but they reshaped the battlefield. Law enforcement showed they were capable of dismantling entire prison empires when they focused resources. And for Oklahoma communities, the convictions offered a fragile peace after years of fire and gunfire. Whether that peace would last remained uncertain, but law enforcement finally landed heavy punches. After the convictions in 2022 and 2023, Oklahoma finally saw violence start to decline. Operation Center of Attention had gutted the Irish mob's prison drug trade and scattered its members. The RICO case crushed the Universal Aryan Brotherhood's leadership and dismantled their meth networks. For the first time in years, Wewoka and nearby towns felt some fragile relief. Residents slowly rebuilt burned houses, and communities tried to heal from shootings and firebombings. Parents could finally let children play outside without constant fear of stray bullets. Families carried scars, but at least daily gunfire no longer shook the small towns. The feeling of constant war faded, replaced by cautious hope that peace might hold. But by late 2023, signs showed the cycle was starting again in small bursts. Shootings and arsons were reported in Wewoka and nearby counties, raising old fears. Local prosecutors announced several new arrests tied to fresh gang-related violence. Residents began to worry that the feud never truly ended. It only paused temporarily. Experts said poverty, meth addiction, and prison culture kept the ground fertile for gangs. As long as drugs and desperation shaped Oklahoma, rival crews would keep rising. For many inmates, joining gangs remained a survival tactic rather than a choice. The farm boy defiance against Aryan control gave courage, but it came with deadly costs. The Irish mob earned a legend for rejecting supremacy, standing as country-tough independents. But that reputation came at the price of bloodshed, families broken, and communities scarred. The Aryan Brotherhood still existed in pieces, and their ruthless history kept them feared. Both sides proved how prison gangs never truly die. They only change faces and tactics. Corrections officials introduced reforms, promising to house rivals separately and improve gang monitoring. Private prisons like Cimarron faced heavier scrutiny after negligence and evidence destruction became public. Officials said lessons were learned, but many Oklahomans doubted real change would last. The memory of September 12, 2015 stayed burned into the state's history. That night in Cimarron still echoes, with blood on the floor and 4 men gone. The violence did not stay behind prison gates, it flooded into small towns. Farm boys stood up to Aryans and refused to bend, but scars spread statewide. The lesson was clear: when gangs erupt inside prison, no community stays safe.